Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back to another edition of Canada Today. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon. I'm your host, Taha Ghayur. I'm back with another show of on Muslim Network TV. And today we are going to be talking to some wonderful experts and professionals who are going to be talking about a topic that is often considered a taboo topic in our community, and that is a topic revolving around our participation in the masjid or mosque, and more specifically, the topic of being unmasked. And we'll talk about this phenomena with two wonderful Canadian Muslim female leaders and how it impacts women in particular in Canada. So I want to get started with by introducing to you Dr. Mona Rahman to the program. She is a senior level researcher with over 13-year experience in higher education at Queen's University. Mona is also an Islamic studies educator and education coordinator for Islamic Society of Kingston, which is a city, if you're not aware, it's a city between Toronto and Ottawa in Ontario. She is the co-chair of the Give 30 campaign, a not-for-profit charity initiative supporting local food banks in Canada. She is also a national board member with Islamic History Month, and holds various memberships with interfaith community level groups. Mona also holds a PhD in biochemistry from Queen's University. So welcome, Sister Mona, on Canada Today.
Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah khairan.
Welcome, salam. Next, we have Dr. Kathy Bullock. Dr. Katherine received her PhD in political science from the University of Toronto in 1999. She is a writer, university lecturer, publisher, and a mother. Over the last few decades, Dr. Kathy has co-founded and sat on the boards of several grassroots and academic organizations, such as Tessellite Institute, for instance. She has also she is also the first ever president chair of a national Muslim organization in Canada called ISNA Canada, Islamic Society of North America, Canada. And she's originally from Australia, and she embraced Islam in 1994. So thank you, Dr. Kathy, for being here with us this afternoon.
Jazakallah khairan. So nice to be with you today.
Yeah, same here, alhamdulillah. So we wanted to start off by talking about, this topic. There's so much that can be talked about. And this idea of unmasked was, popularized, as you may recall, back in 2014 with a documentary that came out on this topic. And since then, this term has been floating around, and even this term itself came from unchurched in the Christian community when a bunch of young people felt disconnected. So I wanted to hear your thoughts for those of us who may not be aware of what unmasked means. What are some implications of being unmasked? Can you get us started off with a definition of what is unmasked?
To the best of my knowledge, the term unmasked came from that documentary that you mentioned, the 2014 documentary, which was produced in the US, and it was an interview with second and third generation young Muslims, but also converts and people from ethnic minorities who felt that they wanted to go to a mosque but didn't feel welcome in that space. So it doesn't categorize the people who are leaving the faith, like who are disillusioned with Islam more completely. I think it categorizes the people who wish they could be in a mosque setting but feel turned away by the mosque that's near them, so they become unmosqued.
Interesting. So from your perspective, being an unmasked person doesn't necessarily mean a person who is moving away. Unlike, for instance, in the Christian community phenomena, typically an unchurched person typically is on the verge of perhaps leaving the faith. So from your perspective, what you understand, it actually could be either or, a person who it may still be concerned about the mosque or still want to be going back to the masjid, but has maybe some barriers. So let's talk about this phenomenon a little further, and what would we mean by being unmosqued, and what are some of those barriers. I wanted to talk to Dr. Mona Rahman about her experience a little bit, and hear from her on this specific topic as we get introduced to this conversation. I know, Sister Mona, you were raised in a beautiful, very tight-knit community of Kingston, Ontario. And you've been very active in the masjid. You were brought up in that masjid, and now you lead, for years you've been leading programs there for other youth and kids and women and men. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, from your experience, you seem to be very connected to the masjid. What are your thoughts on this topic of being unmasked?
Assalamualaikum. First of all, I should acknowledge that I am in Kingston, but this is situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people, and we need to acknowledge this traditional territory and recognize its longer history. So we do have Anishinaabe roots and Haudenosaunee roots, but we also have a significant Métis community and First Peoples from other nations across Turtle Island. And so we are grateful to be able to live and learn, play and pray on these lands and grow and interact with those of diverse backgrounds. And of course, as a Muslim, I acknowledge the responsibility given to us by Al-Khaliq to protect these lands and respect all who live on them. So regarding your question now, so it is a bit of a leap to say that I was raised at the masjid, because the masjid was actually raised before and when I was an adult. So I grew up in a community that did not actually have a masjid until 1996, at which point I was already in my mid-20s. So the masjid came when I was already an adult. So I would like to talk more about maybe the community, so our parents, the forefathers, or the founding members of our community, has always stressed the fact that brothers and sisters are, just as it says in the Quran, we are partners one to another. So this community and the way that I was raised, in that brothers and sisters within the community were always working together to build the community, and that includes building the masjid. So that is the approach, that is the way, the sort of the foundation of how the masjid was built as well. So we were involved as youth in terms of fundraising this. So even if you look at our executive board, in the beginning, there was always a representative from Kumsa, a representative from the youth. Even now, we still have the women's representative, but despite the fact that we have that women's representative, the women on our board are I've never seen a case where the women on the masjid board are restricted to the women's rep. So there's never really been a hurdle with respect to participation there. And you can see that, the ammus, the tants, the uncles and aunties, everybody is working together in terms of building the community, because they were making it for us, the first generation of kids. And so that expanded. So in the building of the masjid, you could see that objective in terms of trying to maintain the sunnah with respect to having, the Prophet's mosque, and that there is a big open area for prayer with no barrier between the brothers and the sisters. I mean, it's just space. It's exactly the same. And then if you looked at the wudu areas, the washrooms and what have you, everything was symmetrical. So there's equal access to both in that case. I mean, things have changed through the years with different needs of the community, but that is the foundation in terms of, we encourage both men and women to be active participants in the masjid. That's how it's always that's how it started, and inshallah, obviously things change as different people come in, but that is something that is held very strongly by the community. And especially also, even though we don't have a youth representative or a Kumsa representative on the board, and that those are other logistical problems with respect to age and voting rights, but there is a very active, you could say, a push to try and include the youth, to try and get their perspective, to try and have programs so that they would want to come to the masjid. Like from youth to children, we want them to love the masjid. Like, as somebody who grew up without a masjid, and our community events were all over the city, mostly at Queen's University. We missed out on that. So we would like okay, I missed out on that, and everybody else has gone off, but we missed out on that. And so we want to develop that love for the masjid within our children. And like I said, we don't, it's not, it is a building, but the masjid should be the hub for the community, all of the community.
And I think you're describing really an ideal mosque or ideal masjid that is open. I mean, structurally, leader in terms of leadership, in terms of the whole mindset, all of that is something that you were, you've done. I think done the right thing, and you guys have had a great experience so far. And I'm sure there are ways you can still improve, but that's a great model to follow. Despite that, there are people who are, I'm sure, even in your own community, and of course, in many masajid and mosques across Canada, there are people who actually feel left out, and they feel that they don't belong there for various reasons. So, maybe we'll have both of you talk to this topic, to this specific issue in a minute. But I wanted to start off with Dr. Kathy. I wanted to ask you, what are some reasons, based on your experience and your research, that lead people to becoming unmasked, which seems to be a norm now for a lot of young women in particular?
There are reasons that it depends a little bit on the group of unmasked that you're talking about. So if I just go through maybe 3 different groups, let's start with the youth. The youth might feel unmasked because the mosque is often seems just irrelevant to their lives. Like they might go on Friday and they hear a khutbah about the battles that happened 1400 years ago, and all of that seems extremely irrelevant. A lot of Arabic words that they may not understand. It just doesn't touch their lives in a way that makes it meaningful. So that would be the first group. The second group would be the women who, the mosque, unfortunately, a lot of our mosques have very yucky spaces for women. So you might have to enter next to the garbage or go up the stairs through very dark hallways. It can be very confusing. You don't know where the wudu is. Then when you get there, you find a tiny little room. I remember once going into a mosque and it was sort of being used as a storage space. And there was room maybe for 3 women to pray, and it was dark. It was very unpleasant. It's not the kind of thing you want to go back to. So that's spaces that make women feel that they don't belong. And then the third group that I'm aware of are, if you live in a mosque that's dominated by an ethnic community and you don't belong to that community, it can just feel very strange. Like you might go in and everyone around you is wearing a particular kind of dress. They talk in their own language. You can't understand what they're saying. Even like the decor, maybe like the pictures on the wall, or the food that's around in the kitchen that you can notice. All of it just makes you realize, oh, I'm not from this group. And if they don't make extra efforts to sort of reach out and make you feel welcome, then you just feel, okay, this is not my place. This is not my space. I said I was going to talk about 3 groups, but as I was talking, I thought of the 4th group. The 4th group are converts. And the answers that I gave just now from each of those other groups can kind of tie it all together for converts. So first of all, they don't feel like they belong tribally to anyone in the mosque because they're, with their conversion, where they're from, or they feel they've been socialized in the West and they go and they find the whole mosque experience very weird and very alienating. Like even their separation of men and women can just seem really, really odd. Or they'll go in the khutbah, the khatib will start yelling and screaming, which a lot of ethnic groups don't mind that. It's normal. They expect it. It's seen as passion. But from a lot of converts, it sounds like, oh, my God, he's yelling. He's really angry. So they experience the khutbah as just a series of anger. And that they didn't come to the mosque to get yelled at. So that's very off-putting. And also just the lack of understanding of Arabic. And also the khutbahs that seem irrelevant. So what I mentioned for all of those 3 groups can kind of tie up for converts in a whole package.
Wow. You mentioned converts. I remember probably about 8 or 9 years ago, after a khutbah, there was a young convert brother came up to me and he said, it took me good 2 months or something to come back to the masjid today for the first time. Because he said, when I went to the masjid, the last I went to the masjid in Ramadan, the imam was so harsh. And first of all, he was screaming, but he was so harsh. on people, and he was saying that if you miss your if you can't fast, or if you miss your fasting, this and this and this and this will happen. And I mean, of course, they may be, from fiqh perspective, all of those may be valid points. But his point was that, this guy's he's new to Islam. He's struggling to practice. And literally, he was in tears when he was telling me all this. And he said, I had such a hard time. It took me 2 months to conjure up this courage to actually come back to the masjid today. And it was so difficult. So it really hit me for the first time how difficult it is for those who, whether it's converts or women or youth or anybody, who, for whatever reason, any of the reasons that you mentioned, if they are unmasked and detached, what it takes for them to come back psychologically. So it was a very difficult week. I remember me thinking about this and reflecting on this, because I always took it for granted. Sister Mona, what are some examples, not examples necessarily, but what other specifics come to your mind when it comes to reasons why people may become unmasked, and women in particular, where it could be anybody?
I actually wanted to jump in on that point about people who have come to Islam later. So it's people who are new to Islam, and that, sometimes it doesn't, no matter what the masjid leadership, that tone that the masjid leadership wants to set in the masjid, at the end of the day, people will interact with the people of the masjid. And everybody's coming with their different backgrounds and their different cultural baggage. And maybe they understand the deen, or they understand the fiqh, but they don't have the hikmah in terms of dealing with somebody who is new to the faith, or dealing with somebody who is growing up as a minority in North America, where we're a minority, and being able to be Canadian and also practice the deen. And one of the most heartbreaking things that I see time and time again is that my experiences have been with the sisters who have come to Islam, and they're very excited, and maybe they've had a buddy, a teacher who has helped them, and then maybe that relationship has, people move, which is what happens in Kingston. People, it's like a rolling door, revolving door. People come in and out. We claim Kathy as a Queen's alumni, by the way. She's one of those that came in and out. But unfortunately, we have very, very, very well-meaning community members who will come, and our new sister will mention something, and they'll jump on that and say, oh, but that's haram, you shouldn't do that. And sometimes it has to do with how their relationship with family members that may be not mahram, or family members that are not Muslim, that you shouldn't have them in your house. That is very, very alienating. And so you're telling this sister to choose between the deen and her family, or there are things that she doesn't understand yet, and you're jumping, oh, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. The deen was given to us, it was revealed to us, where that first decade was just tawheed. And we expect people who come to Islam to go from 0 to 100 in a day, and that's not fair. And we as the community members need to understand that we're all on a path to get to that gold standard. And some of us, were blessed to be in active practicing Muslim families. Some of us came later. Some of us, in adulthood. We're all on the same path, but at different stages. And so we need to deal with each other depending on what stage they are. And unfortunately, because people don't have that hikmah, and this has to do with youth, this has to do with, everybody, that abrasiveness can cause people to leave the deen, right? And especially when I want to say with youth, also, youth, they're learning. They're young adults, but they're still young. And we're supposed to be at the age where we're supposed to be the ones that we're befriending our youth now, right? We've gone through the playing, we've gone through the instructing. Now is the time that we should be their friend and help guide them. They're going to make mistakes just as adults do. But, we don't want to be the ones like, oh, you shouldn't wear this. Why are you wearing this? But to guide them and to get them to that understanding. And unfortunately, when we treat our youth as if they're kids, or that they don't know anything, or, oh, that's bad, why would they come? Like, why would they want to hang out with you? So
Great.
Those are things we need to keep in mind.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Kathy, in one of your articles recently, I believe is the Isna Horizons magazine, you talked about the long-term trend that you have seen of changing patterns of authority. taking place across masajid. So you clearly seem to have had some interesting experiences across mosques, and you're observing these, these patterns, unlike Sister Mona's experience. So I was wondering, how, what does this trend mean? Like when you talk about changing patterns of authority, and how does this contribute to people becoming unmasked and disenfranchised from the masjid?
That's a very profound question. I got this title, "Let Me Be a Proper Academic and Give My Sources." There was a professor in Ottawa, at Ottawa University, Karim, who actually did a focus group study across, I think it was Canada into England, and he actually called his report "Changing Patterns of Authority." So that's where I got that from. And it was done in 2009, but I think that the research that I've done since then only confirms that it was a trend he identified that's continued. And basically that's the trend is that, well, maybe once upon a time, certainly in the pre-modern Muslim world, you would look to your local imam or your local Islamic scholar or the local city notable for guidance on how one should live in all kinds of, things, that from, minor things like how do I interact with this issue with my neighbor, up to law contracts, up to how do I deal with my business. So the whole range of life's experiences, with colonialism, of course, and that whole thing breaking down, and then we got sort of decentered from our tradition. And then we move here and we become minorities in a country like Canada. So perhaps if you came initially and you were from a certain country and your imam at your local mosque was from your country, you might look up to that person as your guide in these issues: child conflict, marital conflict, business questions, whatever. But as the next generation is coming in, and other ethnic groups and the converts that we've mentioned, they don't have that sort of trust relationship with that person at that mosque from that same ethnic background, let's say. And so there's this growing trend of people not really knowing where to turn to for guidance. I think the survey that I reported in Horizons article was that something like only 20% will turn to their local imam for guidance on life issues. And about 42% didn't look for guidance anywhere. So 42% is an incredibly large number. You asked me to describe it. That's my effort to describe it, what the changing pattern of authority means. But then the last part of your question was, what does it mean? And I think that it has a really profound and troubling meaning. Is we are trying to be people who believe in God, who accept the Quran as the final message, and Muhammad, peace be upon him, as the final messenger. We need to receive God's guidance, which comes to us through the Quran and the Sunnah and through the interpretations. Because I can read Quran, and I know people who say, you read Quran, it doesn't tell you to pray 5 times a day. So where do we get that 5 times a day? Then that comes to us through the Sunnah and through the traditions. If you're going to not turn to a local knowledgeable person or even the Quran as your guide, then how are you going to have that true and proper connection with God? Now, I do believe that it says in the Quran, whoever does an atom's weight of good will see it on the day of judgment, and God guides everyone. It's not like Christianity or Catholicism, like where you need to get the guidance through the priest. But I'm saying if people are on their own and they're just praying by themselves, without being connected to the community of interpretation of tradition that can come through the local mosque or the local imam or the local community, then they can be in danger of accidentally going astray. And I don't want to reinforce the point that I don't want to unreinforce the point that Mona's making. Everyone is on their journey, but we need help on our journey. And so if we're not turning to anyone for guidance, then we're just left floundering by ourselves. And so that's for me is the situation and the consequence.
So thank you very much, actually, for expounding on this. And I wonder what Sister Mona, you would have to say when it comes to long-term consequences of people becoming unmasked, regardless of the reasons. I mean, why do you think in your life and the lives of people you work with, mosque is so central? I mean, thank God you seem to be not in a place where things are, it's a smaller, relatively small community, but also a place that you have actually built that is built on the ideals that you know, Dr. Kathy and you both have been talking about based on the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So, you know, what are some of the consequences of people becoming unmasked?
I think what the masjid is, especially here in a country where we are a minority, the mosque is like it was at the time of the Prophet. It's not just a place to pray. It is really the community hub. It is the hub at which, you know, all of the believers will join, whether it's for social things, whether it's for salah, whether it's for, you know, halakat. But and it really allows the Muslims to gather. Even, and this is the thing, when we created, it's called the Muslim Children's Circle now, but in its first iteration, it was called the Muslim Kids Club. So even in that kind of thing in terms of children's activities, you know, you might learn a little bit of deen here and there, but the whole point is to try and gather the children together so that they're with other Muslim children. Because, you know, the Prophet ﷺ told us that the believers are like bricks in a wall, you know, and I, you know, you can see that when one of those bricks is weakened, it is strengthened by those around them. We are going to have ebbs and flows within our iman, and it's, you know, that network of good believers that you have in your network are what strengthen you when, you know, on that path. So I agree with Sister Kathy in terms of, you know, we are all on that path, and each of us should be there to help each other on that path, to guide each other if we have the ability. And so when you're losing that, you know, there's another hadith that says that the wolf, you know, goes after the stray sheep. So when you don't have that anchor in terms of the Quran and the Sunnah and people around you, you do, you know, run the risk of shaitan going after you. I mean, I do recognize also the hadith in terms of, you know, it's better to be alone than in the company of bad people. But, you know, you can always find people, whether it's in real life or on the internet nowadays. So when you have people that are unmasked, that are not going to the masjid, you are kind of floundering in terms of you don't have that anchor. When you're on that, you can, you know, with the analogy of a ship on the sea, maybe you don't have that anchor. So as you come through hardship and things, you know, it is easier for your perspective to shift without you even realizing it. It is a danger, and that's why, you know, I always tell the youth, you know, even, and I do recognize that, you know, sometimes your Muslim friends might not be the best example for you, but you need good friends, good Muslim friends, but also good friends that respect your values to keep you on track. Because you don't necessarily see yourself straying. And, you know, in a mathematical sense, even that little bit of straying, that little one degree angle, if you extend that 1 degree angle up, when you get to the end of the line, you're very, very far away from the sirat. So it's just people that kind of help you to get back and hold on to that rope of Allah that we hear about in Surah Ali Imran. So yeah, so when we have people that are unmasked, you rest that. When we have women that do not feel comfortable in coming to the masjid, I think that is actually even more significant, because if, first of all, you're missing out on a lot of different perspectives. Like, there's a reason why we're partners with men and women. We have different perspectives. We have different ways of seeing things. We have different ways of doing things. So we need each other to get, you know, the ideal. Also, for those women, and I realize that not all women are going to be mothers, but for those that are mothers, if they're not being able to be educated in the deen, that is important in terms of raising your children. If you're not going to the masjid, your children may not be going to the masjid, because truth be told, it's usually the mothers that are taking them to the masjid. And so then you miss out on these children that are not getting the opportunity to attend the masjid, to learn and to meet other Muslim children. So it's I think, you know, to have a masjid that is not accommodating to or welcoming to women is very, very detrimental to a community. And I think we are seeing this in the larger hubs.
Unfortunately, yes. So, well, a couple of things. COVID-19 puts an interesting spin on unmasked terminology. This terminology being unmasked, because now everybody, at least for a couple of months, was unmasked, not willingly. And then, of course, it was difficult. It was a very difficult, challenging experience, particularly for men who were more attached to the masjid, but of course for women and other people as well. But then there was an interesting perspective you heard in the community, especially from women, and they were saying, well, now you know what it feels like. Now you men know what it feels like to be unmasked, and God is maybe teaching you a lesson here, because for so long I have not been able to either enter a masjid, or have not been to the masjid for XYZ reasons, because of whatever number of barriers that were there. And now, of course, we don't have a choice. So it puts a lot of things in perspective and makes us realize what it really is to be unmasked, and what it feels like to be a person who is deprived for whatever reason, not being able to attend the masjid. SubhanAllah. So very, very interesting conversations we heard during this period. So I wanted to ask Dr. Kathy a question, because you mentioned again in your article, specifically in Islamic Horizons, about mosques only solutions for community problems are necessary but not enough. And that's a very interesting statement you made, because I wanted to ask you, is it a bad thing, and both of you actually, is it a bad thing if a group of people do activism outside of the masjid? So we need to separate our personal connection and even family connection to the mosque for purpose of socialization and purpose of spirituality, we have to separate that from activism, which goes beyond the masjid. Our activism, or community involvement, can go and does go many times outside of masjid. So is it a bad thing that there's a group of people who may be doing wonderful things, and there's so many examples, and that they don't think their activism belongs in the masjid? Is that a problem? And I'll ask Dr. Kat to answer that question.
I don't see it as a problem at all. I think it's wonderful if a group of Muslims get together and feel that they have a cause that they want to advocate for and act on. If anybody read that article and assumed that I meant that was a bad thing, then I haven't sent my message out very well. I was trying to say that if a community only focuses on building the mosque and only focuses on making programs at the mosque, then they're going to be missing a large segment of people who don't want to come to the mosque, either because they feel alienated or they just don't feel attracted to it. And so there needs to be also community-based programming that will help those people who aren't coming to the mosque feel and learn about their deen and feel connected to their Muslim identity. So the young people who are, they don't have to be young, but anyone who's an activist who's outside mobilizing their identity for the cause of a greater good, I think that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. So Sister Mona, you come from a community now that's very mosque-centric, mashallah. But I know you do a lot of other work outside as well. You've been involved in interfaith work, you give 30 program. If you look at some of the greatest projects out there, and some great organizations out there in Canada, across Canada, they're not based in mosques, but they do work with mosques, but they're not based in mosques. If you look at RAS Convention, you look at Muslim Fest, you look at, for instance, Max Gala, Nasiya Helpline, the Canadian Muslim Vote. These are all non-mosque based organizations, and there are many other wonderful ones, of course, out there. But yet they're working with mosques. They're working with them as partners. Do you think if people are, don't feel that their project belongs in the masjid, that it is a problem? And do you think there is a danger in them perhaps becoming demosque or unmosque at some point?
I don't think we should look at it in terms of do with the masjid or not with the masjid. There are certain projects that are more that make more sense to not be associated with a specific organization, because it's bigger than that. So Give 30, and I should clarify that I'm not the co-chair of Give 30. I'm the co-chair of Give 30 just in Kingston. So that is a project that, yes, there are people from the masjid that are involved, but it is to serve the entire Kingston community. And I should say that, when back in the days when I was an undergrad, when I was a frosh, I think back in Kumsa, having programs for people that are, as you say, unmosqued or demosqued, or are a little bit hesitant to be involved with with the official Muslim organization. These other causes that are still Muslim based, or maybe not, but they actually can be a sort of a conduit into reconnecting with the Muslim community. And one particular case that I had, and I hope I don't embarrass him, but I'm pretty sure it was Brother Boualem Sekhri back in our Kumsa days, who we knew that there was a segment of the population that for one reason or another were not involved with Kumsa. This is before the masjid was built. And it was the time of the Gulf War. Boualem Sekhri, I believe, was one of the, he founded an organization called International Concern for the Middle East, or ISMI. And through that, many of the students got involved because this was a cause that was very, very dear to their hearts. And through that interaction, they met other people from the Muslim community on campus, and then they started coming to the Kumsa events. So there is a place for that. And like I said, when something is a bigger cause, it might be better to not have it focused coming out of a specific organization, so that it doesn't become limited by that in terms of scope. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, thank you for saying that. So let's talk about solutions a bit. There's so much that we can talk about, and we know that there are grievances out there, especially women who have had to deal with a lot of barriers in the masjids. I remember Dr. Kathy actually was once giving, as a president of ISNA at the mosque, she had to deliver some important announcement in the front, from the front of the masjid, and I remember the level of discomfort some people had with Dr. Kathy, a female, going up to the pulpit, standing there making announcements. So if as a male I go up there and I feel nervous, I can only imagine how challenging it is for a female or somebody else from maybe other marginalized minorities at times, even going up and being in those positions. So I wanted to ask Dr. Kathy, what are some things that masjids can do to better connect with their audiences and to make people feel welcomed and all inclusive in masjids in particular? Because as you mentioned a number of segments in our community who feel marginalized, and there are others, even for instance people with disabilities, or Black community in particular. I mean, they don't feel in many of these places that they belong for various reasons. So what can mosques do, both of you, starting with Dr. Kathy, concrete things that they can do to make their mosques more welcoming and hopefully reach out to and convert the unmosqued people back to being mosqued again, inshallah?
Oh, Brother Taha, you're asking again a very important question, but I hope you don't mind if I just put a little bracket. I was laughing and rolling my eyes when Mona was talking, and there might be people who are wondering why. So I just have to say that the person she mentioned, I ended up marrying. So I remember that organization that he founded, the International Concern for Peace in the Middle East. And when I first met him and his group, actually I wasn't Muslim, I was actually even an atheist. And I remember, because they started talking about Palestinian rights, and I remember being very wary of them because I thought as soon as you defend Palestinian rights, it meant they were biased. Okay, so I was like, oh my God, these Muslims are so biased. I didn't want to have anything to do with them. Anyway, you can see that kind of changed. So that's why I was laughing and talking to Mona like that. And just in case anyone's wondering why she's reacting like that. Um, all right. Now, the question that you've asked, there are probably two aspects that I can think of, or maybe three. The first one is the masjid leadership, of course, needs to reflect the diversity in the community at the board level. So you need to have people, women, different ethnic, different ages, different abilities. That's a first. A second, it also needs to be reflected on the staff. So you need to have different ethnic, women ages on the staff as well. Then you need to consult the people in the community, even if it means going out and doing, town halls or tea and coffee events with people. And it would have to be done through a network, through word of mouth or through social media or something, to find out, what it is about the mosque that's keeping you away. What are the kind of things that you need? What would you like to see there? And then inviting people who are very passionate. If let's say you talk to a young mother who says, "Oh, I really wish there was a kids group here for toddlers," and there isn't one. So then you might ask her, would she be willing to organize it? So you tap into the passion of the people who think there's something missing, because they can become the best advocates for the program, and they also know how to organize it because they know what's missing. They have a vision of what should be there. They might need some guidance in terms of putting a program together. They'll definitely need organizational support and administrative support. So that's the third thing. And then the fourth thing is, as Mona had said earlier, there needs to be some education in the community. I mean, you could have a masjid where the board is diverse, the staff is diverse. They could even have diverse programming. But if somebody comes and has a negative experience because the volunteers haven't been trained, or the local mosque attendees haven't sort of been trained, and this is really hard. Like, this one is probably like the hardest, the tallest order. But if the people in the mosque, let's talk about a convert. She comes in, she wants to attend a new session that has just been organized by the mosque for convert sisters. And on her way through, she passes by and she meets a couple of the ladies, we call them the hijab police. And suddenly they give her a dirty look, or why are you dressed like that? Why are you here? Here, put this scarf on. That's it. Even though maybe all the other pieces in place, that already might make her feel uncomfortable. And I don't actually know quite how to address that. We need maybe the imams, the khutbahs. We need maybe more reading material, more literature. You haven't asked me for sort of any personal experiences, but I can remember we lived in the US for a while, and our tiny little mosque had moved upstairs, and I convinced the community not to put a curtain, even though that was part of their heritage. But they trusted me for some reason. It was a very small community. And I remember one day being at Juma, and I came and found a woman that I've never met before, and she was measuring with her feet across the wall to wall. And I was like, "Oh, hello, how are you? What's going on?" I didn't say hello, probably salam. And she said, "Oh, I'm just measuring so we can put a curtain." And she didn't know, but I was actually on the mosque board. And I said, "Oh, we've made a decision and we're not going to have a curtain." And then she said to me something like, "Are you a convert? Or where are you from?" or something. And I said, "Yes, I'm from Australia." And then she said, "Welcome to Islam." I've been Muslim for like 23 years at that point or something. So just that one phrase, welcome to Islam. And I know basically by her feet measuring, she was telling me, I know better than you, and we're going to put a curtain. But in the end, they did rabble around, and there was a big problem in the community. And then I started being accused of being a feminist and promoting women's rights, and not, it got very nasty for a while. So in the end, yes, they ended up putting a curtain. But to cut a long story short, those three things that I mentioned, if the people in the masjid, as Mona had said, aren't also trained, and I actually not quite sure how we do that, because there are so many different kinds of people who come and go from a masjid space, but they're a crucial part. They can make things, all the best intentions of the mosque, fall apart. And that's why I believe we need to have non-mosque things as well, like those organizations, that are doing social justice events, like that can be a way in. When I was an atheist, in Kingston very hostile towards the Muslims. I wasn't interested in any religious event whatsoever. Yes, they didn't have a mosque, but even if they did and they'd invited me, I still wouldn't have gone. But I did go to those events that were organized around peace in the Middle East and about racism, and those were kind of like my way in, if you like. And that's how I started to make friends in the Muslim community, and eventually came to ask myself, those deep questions like, why, Kathy, why are you an atheist? So we need that as well.
Very, very important. And thank you for sharing those stories. That really helps actually put a lot of things in perspective. What's your advice, Sister Mona, for masjid leaders when it comes to making their masjids more inclusive?
I think Kathy has covered most of them. One of the things in terms of, and like the hardest piece, honestly, is the general mosque population, the general community. One of the advantages I think our generation had growing up when we did in Canada is that, especially in Kingston, which was small, is that you had people coming from all different parts of the world. And they formed this community and they learned from each other and they dissected the Islamic principles from the cultural baggage. And one of the things that as our communities grow and we spend time with our own ethnicities, which we need to get to know each other, is that people think that what you have back home is Islam. And they don't and that is due to a lack of education with respect to what the deen actually says. So that dissection. So, I am very used to people coming new to the community, coming to the masjid and telling me that this is haram. And you have to very, explain to them that this is the sunnah. And even when they this time is different than that, and you go through the question, the stories about, at the time of the Prophet, that men used to look at the women under their legs in sujood. And that is why this is the arrangement. But this is the sunnah. And it's not just for one time, it's for all time. That education piece is so, so important. And it is very difficult to do, especially for people to get out of that mentality, because coming to the West, when you're coming from a predominantly Muslim country, mashallah, I have great respect for our parental generation and being able to, to learn the deen and practice and still raise us as Canadians. But I understand the fear that people have with respect to, everything that is here is un-Islamic, which is not true, and they need to get out of that mindset. With respect to women, for us, it's constant education within our educational programs with respect to, women's rights, and brothers' responsibilities in terms of especially this year, we have been very, very clear and strong in examining anti-Black racism, especially during what the climate is here. We see it in the United States, but we know that it's here. We know that anti-Black racism is in the Muslim community. You can talk about what Islam says about racism till you're blue in the face. Honestly, we all know that. We know that racism is, the first sin of Iblis. But people don't recognize that it is something that is so pervasive within the Muslim community in terms of how our Black brothers and sisters are treated. The assuming that everybody's a convert, that there's no that the knowledge level is not as it just goes on and on and on. And I say this with the passion of having Black sons, the sons that identify as Black. And so there's language barrier. There's so many things because with what Kathy says with respect to people sticking to their ethnicities and maybe only conversing in one language. This is the language of Islam, whether it's Urdu or Arabic. I grew up as a minority speaking as a Bangladeshi, so my identity was no, I'm not Pakistani. But it's that education to get people to realize that these are universal principles and we need to stick to them. And it is a very, very long, arduous process. But I think the biggest thing is that fear that people have that this is not what they're used to, without learning about what the Sunnah actually is, what it actually says in the Quran and the Sunnah, and just sort of by default going back to what their theme is familiar. And sometimes what is familiar to them, what is happening in their own countries, is actually un-Islamic. But we need to look into that.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. We have a few minutes left and we want to conclude very quickly. What I wanted to ask you, 2 questions, 1 minute each from each one of you. First question I want to conclude with is, revolves around the messaging in our khutbahs and sermons. Dr. Kathy, you mentioned something about that right at the beginning, and I wanted to ask you specifically what kinds of messaging you would like our imams to be giving, in like top 3 messages or top 5 types of messages you feel that our khatibs should focus on, so we become more inclusive, and things, of course, as part of that, we shouldn't be doing, basically. So start with Dr. Kathy and then Sister Mona.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I would like the imams to focus on showing how the Quran and the Sunnah is relevant for the issues of the now times. And I don't necessarily mean to get very political with it, but just to give that spiritual guidance for the troubles of today. I would like them not to talk about Canada and the West in negative terms. I'm pretty tired of that Islam versus the West dialogue, and Islam is superior to the West. I mean, we're Western Muslims. So I went to a khutbah once and he talked about how Canada was a toxic environment. So stick to the mosque and stick to the Islamic schools. So then, why are you living here? Like, I would like to see them be more inclusive of the fact that we're Canadian Muslims. And finally, I think that's enough for my minute, actually. I'll let Mona speak.
Great. Thank you, Sister Mona.
Kathy always take my points because we have the same brain. Honestly, with respect to kind of things that we really need to deal with right now, we really need to deal with anti-Black racism within our communities. It is something that we're not talking about, that we're denying, because there's no racism in Islam, but it is something that is pervasive to the point that we don't see it. That is something we need to do. We also need to look at the partnership, the importance of having both brothers and sisters being involved in the community. And we need to stop focusing on the importance of the women in terms of roles of mothers, daughters, sisters, because our roles go beyond that. Not everybody will have those roles, but we are believers in partnership with the men in terms of building a community. And we need to sort of get off of that narrative in terms of, the importance of being a mother, the importance of having daughters, which is also important, but it doesn't. The most important thing is that we are accountable to Allah for our deeds, just as men are, and we are khilafah on this earth. It's not just the men, it's the women and the men.
Excellent. Thank you. The last question for both of you is specifically for those young or old, women or even men, who have unmasked for various reasons. Maybe they have built their own third spaces for healing and for reflection and for communal camaraderie. Those who have moved away for whatever reason, whether it's personal or maybe negative experience or because of messaging khutbah, or they just don't feel any belonging in a masjid. What message do you have? Any advice do you have in 1 minute for such individuals, brothers and sisters who are going through, especially sisters who are going through such difficult times? So, Sister Kathy, okay, you know what? This time we'll just Dr. Mona first and Dr. Kathy after.
Oh no, I have to think. Okay, I understand the reason for people creating third spaces. I do, and sometimes you need that time to heal and to strengthen yourself. But I also feel very strongly that you need to stand your ground and show your presence. And I realize it is very hard, and I'm saying this as somebody who's never had to actually do it. But to educate yourself on what your rights are, come from the perspective of the Quran and the Sunnah. Nobody can argue with that, and you get involved. If it's by slow things, find a group of friends, and slowly you educate those around you and change things from within, inshallah. I know it's very idealistic. Kathy might have a different perspective, but you can't let those things keep going the way they are. They need to be changed, and you can't do that if you separate yourself. You're just causing. I said, I realize that sometimes you need a place to be safe and to strengthen yourself. But at one point, we need to get in and we need to educate the masajid and change.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Kathy.
So now, see, Mona took my answer. I think it's a two-pronged thing. One, you need that time to heal, but you also need to learn to be a little bit forgiving. And Muslims are supposed to make 70 excuses for each other. And there has to be a way of unless the mosque environment is like super, super toxic, but there has to be a way of sort of forgiving and learning to go with the flow a little. You're just going to pray. It doesn't matter what the people around you are doing. You can still do your prayer. You can still focus on God. So you have to, in a way, learn to put on a little bit of the armor before you go in, but not to abandon the place. So if you can be a little bit forgiving, a little bit understanding of where the people are coming from, but still go and do what you need to do in a mosque space, and in tandem, in parallel, find a community where you feel you can heal, and then see eventually if there's a way you can bridge those two things. So to summarize, so don't abandon the mosque, do what you need to do to heal. My two things.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Kathy Bullock and Dr. Mona Rahman, for very practical advice, as well as for sharing your stories and your perspectives. And there's so much I know we could have talked about, so many stories we could talk about. And inshallah, we will have more opportunities to talk about such issues, because this is a topic that needs to be discussed from so many angles in the near future. So look forward to having you again on this show. And once again, thank you, Dr. Kathy and Dr. Mona.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Jazakumullah khairan. And so, folks, that was it for today. You heard from two academic people who are from academic field, as well as who have been part of either national or local Muslim organizations and mosques and masjid settings. They have their own journeys and stories. And they talked about, we just heard from them on this issue of critical and taboo topic of being unmosqued, and what are some of the things that mosques need to do things better, and what are some of the things those of us who have been on the receiving end for them to actually do to heal and to come back to be connected to the masjid, inshallah. I also want to acknowledge some wonderful comments from viewers today. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance, an opportunity to take those up or address those, but please leave us comments, share your story and share your thoughts and your ideas as well on how masjids in particular can improve the way they work in terms of being inclusive. So once again, thank you for watching Canada Today on Muslim Network TV. I'm your host, Taha Ghayur. Thank you very much for tuning in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.